Chapter 22 of Julia Ried. Julia Ried by Pansy. Chapter 22, in which the comfort of mourning is discussed. Our conversation that evening was as far as possible removed from what you would have supposed it would be after a return from a meeting fraught with deep and solemn interests. As usual, Mrs. Tyndall was not present, and was apparently not in the least interested in that matter. The parlor doors stood invitingly open as we entered the hall, and the lady of the house called to us with a sort of languid mirth to take pity on her, and come and help her entertain her husband, as she was tired to death over the effort of trying to keep him from straying away to the reading room or some other tiresome place. So we all went in, Mrs. Tyndall giving most cordially the invitation to Mr. Sayles which Abbie and I had intended to withhold, as we wanted to go directly to our room. As it was, Abbie demurred, but I, unable to resist the temptation of the brilliant room and the company of Mr. Sayles, said, "Let us stop a few minutes," and almost the next sentence that was spoken started our topic of conversation, or rather of debate. "Julia, that shade of drab is exceedingly unbecoming to you," Mrs. Tyndall said, surveying me critically. "Did you ever see your cousin in pink, Miss Ried? She has a peculiar shade of pink that she wears sometimes, which is exceedingly becoming to her. I really wish you could see her in it. But of course she doesn't feel like wearing such bright colors now, poor child." This last with a little sigh and a lowering of the voice. The tone and the sigh irritated me strangely. I replied sharply, "I feel quite as much like wearing pink as ever I did. I'm sure I don't know why I should not." Mrs. Tyndall turned at once to my cousin. "Do you consider it the unpardonable sin to wear mourning, Miss Ried?" Abbie lifted very grave, very wondering eyes to Mrs. Tyndall's face, but answered quietly, "No, ma'am." "Then this child is not a disciple of yours. She has taken up the most unaccountable hobby of late, really gets quite excited about the matter, and, anyone can see, does violence to her own feelings all the time. I really feel that her grief would not seem so heavy on her if she would not fight against nature in this way. Don't you think so?" Abbie smiled pleasantly, and answered promptly, "If there is a fight at all, Mrs. Tyndall, I should call it a fight against fashion, not against nature." Mrs. Tyndall emphatically shook her head. "I should not. It is just as natural to wish to wrap ourselves in black when we are in affliction, as it is to eat when we are hungry." "But, Mrs. Tyndall, suppose it was the fashion when our friends went away, to attire ourselves in brilliant red, do you imagine that we would follow what was natural to ourselves, or what fashion dictated?" "It never will be the fashion, Miss Ried. Black always was and always will be the natural mourning costume. It would be an offense against nature to have it otherwise; and fashion, after all, must follow nature to be accepted. For instance, when she orders waists to become 6 1/4 inches in circumference, and monstrosities resembling inverted coal scuttles to be attached to the back of the head, what becomes of nature then?" This from Mr. Sayles in good-humored sarcasm. Mrs. Tyndall promptly hushed him. "Now, Jerome, don't you interfere. Being a man, you must rail against the fashions, of course, all men do; but I think there is an immense amount of nonsense talked about these same fashions." "I heartily prescribe to that sentiment," Mr. Tyndall interposed, rousing up from his half-buried position in the easy-chair. "If you want to appreciate the force of it, Sayles, marry a wife, and go with her to all the millinery establishments in town, and wait while she tries rainbow-colored patches on her head, and calls them bonnets. That's what I've been about all this mortal day." "Now, Mr. Tyndall, I wasn't in Madame Darrow's 20 minutes, I don't think." "An hour and 3/4 by my watch." Amid the general laugh that followed, Mrs. Tyndall continued, "That's of no consequence, anyway; has nothing to do with the subject. What I want to know is, why is it such a fearfully wicked thing to wear mourning?" "It isn't, is it?" queried Abbie in gentle tone. "Some people seem to think so, and you yourself don't think it right, at least I don't believe you do. Honestly, now, do you?" Thus pressed, Abbie answered simply, "It would not be right for me, because personally I do not approve of it; but I accord to everyone the privilege of deciding the question for himself." "But, do just tell me what possible harm there can be in it. I really am curious to know." There was a little flush on Abbie's cheek, but her tone was as quiet as ever. "There is the objection that lies directly on the surface, Mrs. Tyndall, the unnecessary and heavy expense, and the heavy drain that it brings on the purses of the poor." Mrs. Tyndall shook her emphatic head. "That wouldn't have the least weight in the world with me. I consider the starting point extremely false. There is no necessity for the poor aping us in that matter more than in 100 others. On that principle I could not have a silk dress because my cook can't afford one." "Bad illustration, Mrs. Tyndall," interposed Mr. Sayles. "I am witness that only last Sunday your cook flamed out in a red and green plaid, and you yourself told me that the material was silk." Mrs. Tyndall laughed. "Oh, they will copy us just as far as they are able, there is no question about that," she said, pleasantly. "But, Miss Ried, you haven't given me any arguments yet. This one has no weight with me." "It has with me," Abbie answered, with quiet earnestness. "You and I would very possibly not agree on the silk dress question either, but I don't consider the illustration a fair one. If we accept black clothes as marks of respect for our dead and as tokens of grief, I object to them on the ground that my poorer sister carries just as heavy a heart in her affliction as I do in mine, and in following the prevailing custom, I am but giving her one more temptation to do the same. My creed is that we should not even in so small a matter as that of dress lead others astray." "Miss Ried, you amaze me," interrupted Mr. Tyndall. "You are the very first lady I ever met who considered dress a small matter. The most of them have it in their catechisms that it is the end for which they were created." Abbie turned toward him with a bright little laugh. "I am a very small body, you know," she said gaily. But Mrs. Tyndall brought them back sharply to the point at issue. "Miss Ried," she said, "I hope you will excuse me, but I think that it is nonsense, all that about leading people astray. I don't profess to lead anybody. I dress as I please, and other people have a perfect right to do the same. But I would like to know, just for curiosity's sake, if that is all the objection you have to black clothes?" "'Whether therefore ye eat or drink, or whatsoever ye do, do all to the glory of God,'" quoted Abbie softly; and then, looking at Mrs. Tyndall, "No, ma'am, I have other objections. To me it doesn't seem a good way in which to cultivate a Christian spirit. It has its rise in heathenism in the first place. Has it not, Mr. Sayles?" "A Christian spirit!" echoed Mrs. Tyndall, in great amazement, ignoring Abbie's question. "What on earth has a Christian spirit to do with the color of one's dress? Now, Miss Ried, take yourself for an example. You have lost a friend, I think I have heard. Don't you truly feel at any time as though you would not wear your bright colored dresses any more? As though you must wrap yourself in black?" I turned quickly to see how Abbie bore this cool-blooded reference to her one great sorrow. The red had faded a little from her cheek, but she answered in the same sweet, steady tone: "Yes, ma'am, I did. There were times I felt that all the world ought to robe itself in black because of my sorrow. There were times when it seemed to me the sun ought not to shine, nor the birds to sing, and that no one anywhere ought to be glad and happy any more. Do you think I would have been justified in indulging those thoughts?" "That, of course, was an exaggeration of grief. But what possible harm could it have done to yield to your very natural desire to dress yourself in nothing but black?" "Mrs. Tyndall, to me that desire seems a part of the same idea, only not carried to so great a degree. I realized that as a Christian it was my duty to remember constantly that my best and dearest friend, even my Savior, had sent my sorrow to me, and that it was in some way unknown to me, the best that could come to me. I knew it was my duty to teach my naturally rebellious heart to say, 'Thy will be done,' to check all murmurings, all bitterness; and trying to do this it seemed to me that it would not be a help but a contradiction, while the spirit was struggling for calmness and peace, to clothe the body in gloom, and move about the world a living witness, not to the goodness, but the severity of God." "Yet people must miss their friends, and must grieve over their loss," Mrs. Tyndall said, in a subdued, thoughtful tone, such as she rarely used. Abbie answered very earnestly: "Indeed it must be so while the body holds us; but the grief is heavy enough without seeking by all possible outward signs to press it more heavily upon the weary spirit. I think the whole system of wearing mourning for our dead is productive of two results. To the young and frivolous, when the grief has not been heavy, it affords occupation for the mind, and leads their thoughts hopelessly away from what might otherwise have been a solemn and lasting impression, to the business of plunging the body into the outward mockery of deep grief. And to those whose hearts seem almost broken the custom intrudes, obliging them to think of and plan about petty and exasperating details of dress, and affords them merely the poor solace of nursing the heavy gloom that sometimes sweeps over them when they seem given over to wild, rebellious thoughts. "It's a queer business, the whole of it," Mr. Tyndall exclaimed, breaking in upon the little silence that fell between us at the conclusion of Abbie's earnest words. "I don't know another thing in the whole fashionable world so open to criticism and to ridicule as those proprieties that obtain in our set on the subject of mourning. Was it ever your ill luck to meet a grand lady in full array, crape, bombazine, bugles, and what not, and all for a rich old aunt or uncle that she hated with all the strength of her civilized, Christianized heart? I think that's enough to put the whole thing out of fashion." "People can counterfeit anything," Mrs. Tyndall said apathetically. "I don't think I had much temptation to follow the custom," Abbie continued. "It has, as you say, Mr. Tyndall, its ludicrous side, too distinctly marked if one notices and thinks about it much to accord with deep, real sorrow. I have seen it too often, when it seemed to me but a solemn mockery." "I think it is perfectly natural to desire to wear mourning when one loses a friend." Mrs. Tyndall said this just as positively and quietly as if she had not said the same thing in substance every 5 minutes since the conversation commenced. She had a very provoking way of earthing up the old argument that you supposed you had killed and buried, and presenting it as something new and brilliant. I have seen people since who argued in precisely the same way. Abbie answered her as sweetly as if she had never heard that opinion expressed before. "Do you think it is perfectly natural to continue to wear it, Mrs. Tyndall?" "I don't understand your question, my dear," Mrs. Tyndall answered, with equal gentleness. "Why, to continue wearing black on and on for years and years, from girlhood until one is an old woman, or until she dies. Would that seem natural?" "Why, no, of course not. After a proper length of time one ought to lay it aside, of course." "That brings us to a point that is exceedingly trying to me. Who has given the world a right to say to us, 'There, you have mourned long enough. It is a year now since that grave was closed. Yesterday it was perfectly right and proper for you to be wrapped in black, but today get out your blue and pink and scarlet, and be gay again.'" "What a queer way of putting it," said Mrs. Tyndall, and she laughed her sweet, silvery laugh. "And yet time does heal over heavy wounds." It was Mr. Sayles who said this, but I turned to look at him in order to be certain. The voice was so unlike his, so gentle and tender, almost pleading in its earnest questioning. Abbie answered quickly: "It does indeed, or how could any of us live? But it would be very hard for me to be dictated to even in this; to be told that such and such things are not in keeping with my mourning, if they were in keeping with my heart. I like God's way best, that of teaching the Christian heart in its sorrow to rest on Him, and go bravely, earnestly, cheerfully about life's duties and cares, yes, and joys, waiting patiently for the rest that such a life will bring, rather than the world's way, which says, 'Here, to day you must wear crape, and you must make no calls, no, even on your best friends, because you are in mourning; but tomorrow you can dress yourself in spangles and go whither you will. It will not be necessary for you to show respect to your dead any more.' If it is a mark of respect to my dead, who are tonight in heaven, to shut myself in from human sympathies and human pleasures, and robe myself in gloom, I for one won't do it forever, not for a year, or 2 years, or 6 months, as fashion may dictate. But if, as I believe, it is not only showing more respect to the Christian dead, but more submissive love to the God who called them from us, to go bravely about our usual work, taking what joys we can find, bearing with what lightenings we may, our heavy crosses of pain, why, I want to do that." She rose as she spoke, and having finished her sentence smiled and bowed a gentle good night. "Jerome," said Mrs. Tyndall solemnly, "Miss Ried has undoubtedly been very eloquent. I appreciate her efforts on my behalf, but nevertheless, when I die I want you to wear crape on your hat for me." "I'll do so with pleasure, Mrs. Tyndall," he answered gravely, with a profound bow. "I assure you there shall not be so much as an inch of the original hat left to view. With this solemn and utterly undeniable proof will I attest my appreciation of your worth." Then he held open the door for Abbie and myself to pass, giving us only a grave, respectful bow for good night, while Mr. Tyndall was exploding with laughter over his last remark. CHAPTER 23.